All right, here we are. It's Saturday, so we are doing a study session here at Rec Poker, a little study group based around one of a few different topics as the month rolls through. This week is the third Saturday of the month, and so we are talking about a Learn Pro Poker training video that Ryan LaPlante made and released to the Learn Pro Poker members. And since Learn Pro Poker and Rec Poker have kind of a partnership where we're working together to share our love of poker with the poker world, we got to watch a full hour of that video like we do every month. And that video comes out on the first day of the month. So if you're a Rec Poker Premium member, you can go to the archive. And on the first day of the month, you'll see a post from LPP that has an hour of their own premium training video. And then we give our members a few weeks to absorb that themselves. And then we get together here on the study group to talk about some of the concepts from the video. So this video was part 2 of Ryan's hand history review of a $33 entry tournament that he binked. And there's a lot of different kind of concepts that get covered in it. Last month, I know it's a review through Poker Tracker, which is where Ryan does most of his work, which is fantastic. It's a great program. And we did get into some kind of interesting concepts in this one. First of all, Kian, Kim, Carlos, Adam, Stuart, thanks for joining us this week. Was there anything about the video or Ryan's style of review or what he is thinking about while he's in the hand, or was there anything that you wanted to talk about or ask questions about or discuss with the group?
His thinking is super fast on the fly. Like sometimes you barely, like he's just boom, 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 boom. Like he just, and then I found it really rewarding to see that he says, oh, this is something I do. This is a spot where I would bet small. And then he makes a big bet. It's like, okay, so he doesn't always get it right.
That's right.
That was good to see.
I think that is really valuable because especially, as he's going through, he's multi-tabling, he's making quick decisions, like you say. And I think the trade-off that we make when we're multi-tabling, when we're making those quick decisions, is that we make, bread and butter decisions very quickly, but we do kind of leave some exploits out there, some kind of sophisticated tweaks that we could make to it. And then, as he says, by the time he gets down to the final table, he's got fewer tables up. He's really focused on this one. And I like the idea that, even the pros make mistakes and they make, silly little errors or things that they know aren't right when they think about it for a second, because that does kind of make me feel better when I'm doing the same thing. Well, thanks for joining us, Dave. If you have any questions about Ryan LaPlante's hand history review, just pop it into the chat or feel free to join the panel here, but there's no pressure at all. One of the things I really liked about this part, this 1 hour of the video, is the questions that Ryan's asking. There's one thought process that I think is really important. And Kim, you talked earlier about sizing and board texture. And I think that is really key, especially for recreational players like us. I'm not sure we really factor in how important board texture is when we're considering the actions to take. And sizing is the other really big one. And when I'm dealing with coaching clients, I talk about this concept all the time, which is how big will the pot and the stacks be if this bet gets called? And I think there's just like this concept of pot geometry is really basic, but it's something that we don't think about enough in the moment, especially when we're trying to think about future streets and the options that are going to be available to us when we're talking about sizing. I think every time we make a bet, every time we consider a raise, we should think, when they're considering the sizing, if this gets called, how big is the pot going to be? And what will the stack sizes be behind? Because if you just ask yourself that one question, as Ryan points out, I think you can avoid putting yourself in some weird situations where on the next street, your stack is just not, the effective stack is just not the right size for what you want to do with it. And those kind of unforced errors are a killer. You can't argue about variance, you can't argue about getting kings in versus aces, but you can save yourself from unforced errors. And that's a good example. Did you guys notice any, what did you think about his check raising candidates in some cases? Ryan is obviously a very aggressive check raiser compared to, the player pools that we're interested in playing in? Was there anything about the hands that he chose
Do you
that
have any specific examples
there
to
was
show
one?
us? Do you have
Well,
any?
it's interesting
Because I can't remember them.
there was one where what was it? So he check raises queen 6-3. The flop is queen 6-3, and he check raises with ace 6. There was another one where the flop is 9.
Oh yeah, I remember that one.
And he check raises with 7-8. And it was a really good, to your earlier point, Kim, it was a really good example of sometimes you're using hand strength to determine when you're check raising. Sometimes you're using board texture to determine when you're check raising and how it interacts with your opponent's range. And sometimes you're using qualities of your opponent to determine when to check raise. Because he said in a couple spots, like, I would check raise here against a weak player. And I think what he means in that spot is that a player that's going to overfold here. And so that's kind of similar to saying, I'm going to check raise here because my opponent's range is weak. Again, it almost doesn't matter what's in your hand unless you're holding a blocker, because your hand strength isn't really what is determining whether you're going to check raise here or not. It's more about, in this spot, I can exploit a weakness in my opponent by check raising. So then you have to look down and say, okay, well, is this a good hand to do that or not? But yeah, I mean, he's an aggressive player. He's always telling us to be more aggressive pretty much on every street. So, and a check raise is a good place to find that. Kim and Kian, what?
He had an interesting.
Yeah, go ahead.
He had an interesting spot in the small blind where he limped in with 9s versus the big blind. Do you remember that hand?
I did, and
then he ends up raising on an ace 10 ace board.
I remember that one. He said, "Oh, I should have 2.5x that." I wrote that one down because I saw him limping too, and I thought, that's weird. Given the spot, but he did say he should have 2.5x that. So that made me feel like I wasn't actually losing my mind. I did notice that he was very happy to get what I would consider a fairly large amount of chips in the middle, pre-flop in a couple spots with not particularly good hands. And I know, again, that's just that's a question of ranges sort of being solved pre-flop. But I didn't get the impression that Ryan was trying to preserve his skill edge for many parts of this tournament. And I was a little surprised, only because he's obviously such a better player than so many of the other players in this tournament that it would make sense to me that he would want to play less, committed to a hand, because he's going to be able to take it away from weaker opponents. But maybe, this is just the way that he does that. And so
he talked about that, and then he said that was in part due to the structure of the payouts in this tournament, that the top spot wasn't huge,
right?
And it was only 17% of the prize pool. So he talked a little bit about that when he was deep in the tournament.
And that's one of the, because we talk a lot about there's so many factors to consider in every hand. And hey, thanks for joining us, Eric. Always nice to see you, my man. I'm glad you're here for this one, because Eric also plays a lot of cash, which like I grew up in cash, and we talk about Ryan's talking about the difference between the future game simulation value and the ICM value of a spot. And so, I mean, we're all fairly familiar with ICM, the independent chip model, which basically just means that the chips that we lose are more valuable than the chips that we win in the tournament structure, as opposed to in a cash game. So it's a way to kind of evaluate the value of your stack, and when to be more aggressive and when to be less aggressive, to obviously to dumb it down too much to be very helpful. That's essentially what that is. Whereas the future game simulation, or FGS, is more about this notion of, in future stages of the game, if I have a bigger stack, am I going to be able to make better plays? Am I going to be able to extract more value from the tournament with a bigger stack than I would be with a smaller stack, which might encourage you to gamble up a little more. That's not really the right way to say it, but to invite more variance as an opportunity to double up or triple up. Chip utility, says Adam in the chat. Yeah, thanks. Thanks. That's what I'm getting at here. So for a player like Ryan, who obviously is going to have a huge skill edge on the field, that's going to be one of the factors that we think about here. And then, as Kim says, another factor might be the payout structure. How valuable is it going for first place? Panel, how do you guys weigh these different factors in real time? Is this even something that's in your mind? Because I'm always thinking, when I'm playing in a tournament, sort of in between hands, I'm thinking about stuff like this. But when I'm actually in a hand, I find I'm really, that place isn't in my mind as much. I'm more focused on the features of that hand. What about you guys?
I think it comes, for me, it comes in my pre-flop selection. So yeah, I think about, like, is this a hand I'm going with? Is this a stack I'd call a shove? Is there reshove stacks behind? So I think for me, I focus most about it before I even get a hand, right? Before I even get involved.
Mm-hmm.
And probably like you, once you get involved, now you just, right, you're involved, you're trying to win the hand. But yeah, I mean, but I think at most of my thought process, it weighs mostly in if I'm going to get involved in the first place.
Mm-hmm. I think that's smart. And that is where a lot of these decisions, there's this knock-on effect from pre-flop, right? Where I think maybe the most valuable decision you can make is whether to even get involved or not, right? In some of these spots with some of these cusp hands. That's definitely the way I think about it. Because, you can save yourself a lot of pain on turns and rivers just by getting to the flop with a stronger range of hands, right? So having this kind of like meta game central in your mind when you're considering how aggressive to be, how much variance to invite, I think that's exactly the right time to be thinking about it.
So when he talks about future game simulation, is that very similar to future skill edge?
I think it is very similar. I'm not sure they're synonymous, to be honest with you, but I think that's the general idea.
Yeah, I think it goes to the idea of chip utility. Like if you're a big stack, you can bully the medium stacks if they're if they're short in the bust, that you'd have that advantage. Whereas if
that
you're,
sounds similar to ICM.
Yeah.
I think the reason I kind of tie it to skill edge is because it's kind of like how you might use ICM later better than your opponents, or like how the benefit of having a big stack later is more valuable in certain tournaments than in others because of ICM. But it means that in the moment that you're in the decision point now, you might weigh ICM less because it's one of those tournaments where it might be more valuable to have a bigger stack later. And I think that could be because of the structure or because of the field.
Right. So then you're more apt to be able to take on variance. So you're taking on more variance.
I think
certain spots.
Yeah, I think we're probably not. I think we're probably talking around it very well. Like I don't think. I think that's completely consistent with what we're talking about. He talks about if it's a soft field, then typically you would want to prioritize ICM, which is the nittier theory, to preserve your stack. And that this would be because in a soft field, you'd want to preserve your ability to execute your skill edge later in the tournament. And the example he gives is calling ace jack offsuit in the big blind instead of 3-betting. So that's in a soft field. So I think we can, between us, we can agree that a corollary to that is that in a very, very difficult field, you would probably choose to embrace the variance more because you're going to be, you're not a favorite in the field. And then he says, on the other hand, if it's a top heavy field, like if it's a top heavy tournament, like you really have to get to the top 3 to get paid, then the future game simulation, as Adam says here, the chip utility model is more relevant because getting to the final table isn't quite as valuable in this tournament relative to getting to the top 3. So you're preserving your stack isn't quite as valuable as getting to that top 3 stack. So I do think that is the way to think about it, Kim, between embracing variance and shying away from it. ICM is very shying away from variance. Adam says in the chat, FGS even more so against good players. It gives utility to take advantage of the ICM pressure you can put on people. Yeah, right. Because they're going to be more sensitive to the ICM pressure. So that's a good point because, novices and beginner players are not very ICM savvy. They tend to make ICM disastrous decisions at final tables and around bubbles and things like that. So you don't have as much pressure to wield against those players than you do against experienced players. That's a really good point, Adam. So it's another example of just how, poker is all about trade-offs. We talk about making decisions all the time. What are the factors we should be thinking about when we're taking hands street by street? And often, we talk about like ace-5 suited. It's such a good hand to call. It's such a good hand to raise. How do you weigh the different factors? And sometimes you just have to think about it in terms of trade-offs. And what's the trade-off that you're going to make in this spot? And FGS and ICM is kind of one of those things where you're just weighing them against each other from spot to spot. Yeah. So that was an interesting subject that came out of there. So I remember.
I like how he really bullied the bubble. Like he really applied a lot of pressure on the bubble, which I think is really good to see when he's like just raising total trash. Good to see that people can do that and what stack sizes you would want to do that with.
Yeah, and when he was the big stack, he was shoving over a 30 big blind stack with not very strong hands because there were smaller stacks at the table. And it was a really good example of just purely the pressure play involved and how deep you can be and still shove there and not worry about it because there's just so much pressure on that medium stack to fold that it really is another one of those spots where it's a frequency play more than a hand strength play, which we talk about a lot, right?
Yeah, I think he was picking small pocket pairs kind of thing for those because they've called they're not doing too badly in that situation.
That pocket 2s was an example, I think, and there was another one. There was another one in there. And we talk about this a bit on the podcast too. Check raising candidates or overshove candidates, and how sometimes you have to do it according to hand strength, and how sometimes it kind of has to be done by frequency. And one example of this is like we see a board where the flop comes 10-3-2, and Ryan chooses to check raise with 7-8 offsuit. So it's one of these spots where on a board normally we would say we want to check raise sets, we want to check raise 2 pair, we want to check raise strong draws, we want to check raise some total garbage. You can decide yourself how polarized or linear you want to be with it, but it's generally going to be a range of value hands and draws. So on a lot of boards, there are a lot of natural candidates to use for a check raise. There'll be a straight draw or a flush draw, on a board like 10-3-2 Rainbow, there just aren't that many natural check raise, draw, bluff candidates. So what that means is that we have a couple options. We can just only check raise the hands that are good to check raise. Like, I don't know exactly what that would be here, the 4-5 for the straight draw, ace 4
Sets.
ace 5, I guess. Yeah, sets.
Small
course,
sets.
Yeah, sets. Always good candidates. Although maybe not top set because you're blocking all that top pair value. But anyway, that's another subject. So if you're gonna do that, small. If you're nice, there you go, Kim. If you're gonna do that, then you're just check raising at a much lower frequency because there aren't as many natural candidates, and that's fine. Or you could just decide that you're still going to check raise more because your opponent is still over c-betting, and you want to have like a minimum defense frequency kind of approach. You want to be check raising at a high enough frequency to make them indifferent to c-betting at the frequency that they're currently c-betting at. So in that case, you're going to have to choose some candidates that are not value hands or draw hands. And you can talk about how to choose them. Blockers are a good way to do it. And otherwise, it's just going to be strictly on those boards where you think they're more likely to be bluffing. And then you gotta just take a swing and hope that you're not wrong this time, or else essentially what you're going to be doing is overfolding or overcalling in those spots. And you just can't always have the perfect hand that the spot requires. Now, you don't always have to take that check raise, but ultimately you got to start looking at hands like 7-8 offsuit. When the flop comes 10-3-2 Rainbow, you got to look at hands like 7-8 offsuit and think, okay, is this going to be a hand that I check raise here? Kim?
Yeah, the interesting part about that, something else that I learned last night, that type of flop is the type of flop that the aggressor should be betting 100% of the time with a small sizing.
Right.
So when you know that, and you have hands that can do some backdoor damage, it's a good candidate to check raise from the big blind.
Yeah. And that's all, that just speaks to the assumptions you're making.
Yeah, and just so everybody knows, those are like the characteristics, either ace or king high, or queen, jack, or 10 high, and two other cards that don't, that are between the 4 and the 8, which is very specific.
Yes.
This was 10-3 deuce, so it was a perfect hand to bet range for the pre-flop raiser. To bet to 100% c-bet and to c-bet small. So with his specific hand, it was a great check raise candidate.
And I like that one of the assumptions that we're making here is that the in position player is c-betting at a very high frequency. So if you told me that they were c-betting at a very low frequency, we wouldn't need to manufacture some check raise combos like this, right? Because they wouldn't be c-betting wide enough for us to take advantage of. But because our assumption is that they are c-betting very wide, our only choices are to not check raise enough, or to check raise enough, but with hands that make us uncomfortable sometimes. And that's part of poker, I think.
So this has made me think of when I'm playing online to not just look at their c-bet frequency, but to look at both their c-bet frequency and is this the type of board where you have a high c-bet frequency.
Nice.
So
I like that a lot. Yep, absolutely. And if you're using the Rec Poker HUD, you should be able to see at a glance what their fold to check raise stat is. And that should also inform how bluffy you want that check raise range to be. Because people tend to be not balanced in their check raising range. And the way that they check raise tends to be how they think about check raising. So if you see someone that has a check raise of 4%, they're only like, they probably think check raising is a pretty strong move. They only do it with really strong cards. And when you check raise, they're probably also going to think that you have really strong cards. If someone check raises at like 15%, they're probably check raising with a more balanced range, and they're probably Well, they're more likely to think that you might be check raising with a more balanced range too. Plus, if they're check raising 15%, they probably have a HUD. So they're going to be drilling down on you. Kim, I also like to look at c-bet in position versus c-bet out of position, and that'll help. That doesn't help. That can inform how they think about the strength of their own c-bet as well sometimes. I do think like the flop is the place to take it away from some players, and so it's nice to know players fold to 2-bet, fold to check raise, fold to float, and then turn c-bet also is really key there, of course. But I do think there's like, if you can get some reliable tells on people for how they respond to check raises, then there's a real bottleneck in the hand there where you can really punish some people that aren't playing in a balanced fashion.
I agree with you, but I think that you can get carried away with looking at their stats instead of looking at the board.
I agree.
So
yeah, and don't I use the HUD as a crutch a bit, I think, sometimes, because I just get so I'm just so in love with it, I can't help it. But yeah, board texture I think is something that we all need to be paying more attention to. And it really should factor into not only the actions that you take, but also the sizings that you choose in those spots. So I don't know if everyone remembers, poker strategy is all about cycles, and things come in and out of fashions, just like bell bottoms are back. There was this whole conversation, it seems like 15 years ago, about like protection betting, and that was like denying equity was a thing. And then there was this time where, talking about protection betting was kind of like out of vogue, because you were only supposed to ever bet if you had a value hand or as a bluff, and there were no in-between bets. But I think equity denial and the concept of protection is back, baby. And it's part of a more a gray area approach to poker, a more spot specific approach to poker that is really more appropriate for the modern world. And Ryan talks a lot about equity denial and protection in various spots where he chooses to make bets or shoves, where we talk a lot about how it's an action that means that it's only going to be played perfectly by our opponent. So we'll be in a spot where we make a huge overbet such that the only hands that would continue in our opponent's range have us crushed. So that there's a kind of a tension there, I think, when we in our own discussions talk about this, where we're like, oh, well, I had a blocker, it's less likely that they're going to call, but when they do call, I'm always crushed. How do you guys feel about that tension, or how do you choose to weigh those different factors when you're considering spots like that? Like, Kim, you've talked about equity denial and protection in our conversations a bit. Or Eric, if anyone wants to jump in with that.
So yeah, I've heard there's different ideas about, why do you bet? Why do you, equity denial, equity realization, all this. And I think the idea I like is that it's rarely strictly one reason. So, I mean, there might be a primary reason. Oh, I'm betting here for value, but sometimes if I bet here for value, yeah, I want a weaker hand to call. But if I fold out a hand that has pretty significant equity, that actually is a pretty good result as well. So it's not always strictly one or the other. And then I heard the idea of like that you really only have a true bluff on the river with no more cards to come. Yeah. Your hand truly either has 100% equity or 0% equity. So that's the only time that you're truly bluffing. So, I mean, so yeah, so I do think about like, it's rarely just one thing. There might be a primary thing. Yeah. I primarily raise with my aces to get to get value. But if everybody folds to me, hey, that's still a good result because I've reduced the variance. I've won the pot 100% time when everybody folds to me.
Yeah, there's a good
Yeah,
spot.
I agree with that. I think too that there's no rules that this is what you do in every spot with this hand. I think that you have to look at every situation in its own small bubble. Sometimes you're betting for value and equity denial. Sometimes you're, you know, you so it, sometimes you're betting as a bluff, and those can be equity realization. Both of those can be equity realization. So I think that's the importance of doing hand histories, because when I do this with aces in this hand, it can be completely different from when I do aces with this in this hand. And it all has to be looked at in the context in which it occurs. So.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think we, as we evolve as poker players, we want to have like general rules. We want rules of thumb when we get started, right? We want like opening raising charts, and we want to know like how big an opening raise size should be and how big our three bet should be. And like, when I was learning, I found it comforting that there were like rules that I would always like three bet smaller in position, three bet bigger out of position. I like wouldn't play ace 10 offsuit from under the gun, stuff like that. And I think the better we get at poker, the more we kind of become fluent in the language of poker, the less we kind of use it's not like we're using a phrase book with just a bunch of little translated phrases that we know to get through conversationally when we're visiting a different country. Now I feel like we're kind of learning the grammar and the syntax of poker. We're kind of learning the more sophisticated ways that it comes together and how to use it and how to tell stories more fluently in it and things like that. And that means not thinking about it in terms of rules as much and thinking about it in terms of spots, in terms of situations. And situations have some things in common with other situations, but they're going to have things that are not in common with those as well. And this is what we started talking about right at the beginning of the episode, was how do we prioritize these different factors when we're in a hand, and how do we know which ones are more important in this hand in this moment?
Right. And that's one of the reasons why solvers, when you look at solver outputs, there's such a like, okay, this isn't like, we don't do this 100% of the time. There's this is done with this much and this is done with this much. And it's, so you can only just get general ideas, and then you have to take them to the situation you're in. Right. So.
Yeah. And that's why I like using tools like Flopzilla and Equilab to learn spots like this. And again, we're just talking pre-flop. Again, this is a pretty simple example, but let's just use like Flopzilla, when you can set up a spot like this and take a look at it, and then just make one change. Just change one thing. Change the flop, or change the stack size, or change the position. Change the range of your opponent, or whatever it is, and then see how the situation changes. And solvers are also like GTO Plus. We use this all the time in the focus and stuff like that. Because then you're not really memorizing the output. You're recognizing what changed when the factors changed, and what are the things that are actual relevant factors to that decision-making process in the time. And I think that's the best way to study this kind of stuff, as opposed to just like trying to memorize answers.
Yeah, good point.
So a couple other thoughts that I had when I was watching the videos. I know we talk about how of course, I still like rules. I still like having rules. It makes it easier for me to play poker. One of the ones that Ryan introduced here: if you're under ICM pressure, don't take it post flop. And we talk often on the podcast about how sometimes pre-flop the low variance approach is actually just to shove, and you're actually inviting variance by calling and having to go post flop and seeing a bunch of different flops, and then and ICM pressure is kind of the same way. You're actually taking it post flop, you're inviting ICM pressure. If you shove pre-flop instead, even though you are putting your chips at risk, it's actually better to do that or to fold in a lot of cases.
It's lower variance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Lower variance. And so, one way we can look at that and make one of these general rules that we like is, as Ryan says, like if you're under ICM pressure, which for him, he's talking about like at the final table, if you're one of the stack sizes that is under ICM pressure, then just don't take it post flop. And usually the stack that's going to be under the most ICM pressure is like the second smallest and the third smallest. Because the smallest is really under very little ICM pressure. They're likely to bust next anyway. It all depends on how the stacks break down, of course. And the biggest stack is under very little ICM pressure because they literally cannot lose the tournament on that hand. But everyone else is on somewhere on the scale. But the second smallest and the third smallest are usually the ones that are vulnerable and also really want that small stack to bust before they do. So they're good targets to shove over the top of. Another good point, in this very exploitative fashion, Ryan limps a lot with very strong hands because he recognizes that other players are also going to be trying to maximize the ICM pressure. And so he's under-repping the strength of his hand by limping because he's planning to call in those cases because he thinks the range that his opponents will shove with is a dog to the range, to the strength of his hand at the time. I think pocket jacks was an example. I don't know exactly some other examples that he did it with, but they were strong hands that he wanted to realize his equity with. And he felt like it was better to do that as a limp call than as a shove or as an open raise call. And I mean, one way, and we can see this pretty intuitively, is that it's someone can shove over a limp with a wider range than they can shove over a 2 or a 2.5x open raise, because they're going to perceive that limping range as wider, so they can shove over the top with a wider range. So if you want someone to shove over the top of your limp with a wide range, this is where kind of like the leveling war comes in, right? And you just have to decide, are these players to my left going to make the kind of mistake that players on level 1 make? Or are they going to make the kind of mistake that players on level 2 make? Or are they going to make the kind of mistake that players on level 3 make? And then I have to set the trap that's appropriate for the level of the prey that I'm hoping to catch, right? There's nothing makes me feel dumber than setting a trap on level 3 and someone on level 2 comes by and makes me pay for it because they never even saw the trap. They just, I out fancy played myself. I out clevered myself. I out leveled myself. I made a bad assumption about what level they were on. And boy, don't I feel smart and sophisticated for this whole sneaky little thing I was doing. And they're just standing there with a club waiting for someone to walk by. So that is something. You got to tailor your exploits for the people that are actually sitting across from you at the table, not who you think they should be or who you want them to be.
Is that a form of fancy play syndrome?
You nailed it, Kim. And I know for a fact that fancy play syndrome is not hashtag pet vet approved. So we don't even have to go. We don't even have to go to the source for that. I know how Pet Vet feels about that. It's right up there with half pot bets. So one other great point that Ryan makes here that I think people don't do intentionally enough is establish defaults for the villains' sizings and timings. And if you're playing online, you can change the stats. You can change the rules for Note Tracker. If you're playing with Poker Tracker 4, you can configure Note Tracker, and you can add a bunch of different rules. You can change the way they're presented to you in the HUD, and so you can break it down by size of the action, whether it's an open raise size or a shove size, things like that. So that's extremely helpful. And I think people are not very savvy about how they do that. I think the players that tend to diverge don't do it in a balanced fashion. And so it becomes a valuable tell over time. If you're playing live, or if you're playing with a more simple HUD because you don't like the screen space or Whatever. Everyone has their own HUD that they like using. But mine's the best. Anyway, you would find that you would just have to pay attention to it, and you'll notice that some of them will, appear unusual to you. There was a spot here where I don't recall if it was a 3-bet. I think it was a 3-bet sizing or a raise over limp sizing, where Ryan noticed that this person had a typical size of 6 or something like that, and then they put up a different sizing in a different spot, and he was able to extrapolate some information about the strength of their hand. And that's something people are going to pay attention to, folks. So don't change the sizing of your bet or raise according to the strength of your hand. There's so many other things you could change it according to that's public information. And what you really don't want to do is change it according to private information, because that's a way to indicate to the outside world what that private information is. Why would you want to do that? So if you want to have different open raise sizing or open 3-bet sizing, do it according to your position at the table. Do it according to the effective chip stack. Do it according to your relative position to the original actor. Those are all public information. No one can tell anything about your hand strength if you raise bigger out of position and smaller in position every time. But if you raise bigger with ace king and smaller with ace ace, then that's, man, people like me that have a HUD are going to tear you apart. So, again, everyone has to decide for themselves how important that kind of level of balance is, but I do think it's important.
Hey, Jim.
Yeah.
Yeah, back to the limping issue that you were talking about. Now, I have to admit, I didn't get a chance to watch the second part, but did Ryan do the limping late in the tournament, or is it based on the softness of the field, of the table he's sitting at that particular point of the tournament? When is it that he was implementing the limping?
At the final table,
okay.
When stacks were very short. And I think, so it was in a spot where lots of people had like 8 to 20 big blinds. And I think he just felt like if he open raised there, a lot of those middle of the range hands are just going to fold for ICM reasons, but that those players might choose to put them in a raising range instead versus a limp. And I think it probably is less effective when the effective stack gets higher, because people can just raise to a different sizing without having to go all in. And then I think you're more effective to then be open raising again with those hands. But to answer your question, it was in that final table spot where stacks are small. And I think it was because he felt like they were kind of handcuffed to a shove or fold spot.
What was the average big blind chip stack at the final table there? It wasn't a turbo, was it? It wasn't like.
There were, when the final table started, I think someone had about 60, someone had about 40, and then a bunch had like 20, and a couple had very small stacks. Okay. By the time we're talking about, by the time it was like 6-handed or 5-handed, it was down to, there were like 2 big stacks, and then a couple had like 8 to 15. And so I'm not sure what the actual, and when you get to final table, like
I'd say average was close to 25 or something like that, maybe 20 to 25. So. Yeah.
And average it is important, but when you get to final tables, the absolute number of chips is almost more like the distribution is important in a way that the average is helpful. But what really matters is like, how are they distributed? Is there 1 really small stack? Are there 3 really small stacks? Is there, because that's going to affect the dynamic of the final table a lot. Thanks for that question, Kim. Because I know I always want to start talking about limping in deeper play because fancy play syndrome. But this is one of those spots where I think the poker world is catching up to the fact that there is a place for limping in small stack poker, and you really just have to choose your opponents for how you're going to use it.
What do you guys think about the limping strategy on the money bubble? Because I assume that ICM takes effect there too. Maybe not as much as a final table scenario, but I think money bubble is probably a point there too. What do you guys think?
I don't think it's a good idea.
No.
on the money bubble because it can just be exploited. If you're limping and planning to fold to any type of raise, then the big stack is just going to keep raising with any two cards because it's the money bubble.
And also there's
And that's
action
what
on
they
other
and that's what they're
tables.
supposed to do.
Right. And Adam says in the chat, the money bubble has more ICM than the final table in some spots. Yeah, I think that's right. And also because there's action on other tables, I think that factors it in differently as well, because all the chips aren't like actually in play right here. But I think if you were on a table where the stacks were short, I could see this being effective. But it would depend on what level do you think your opponents are on, right? Because you're actually hoping that they're going to be savvy enough. Like, let's use pocket jacks as an example. I think that's one of the hands that Ryan limped with. If you're on the money bubble, I mean, you got to ask yourself, A, do I really want to get involved with jacks? Like am I set mining with jacks? But you could choose to limp because you're basically saying my opponents are going to be savvy enough to understand the ICM pressure that I'm going to be under. And they're going to be shoving hands that jacks dominate exploitatively, but they're not going to be savvy enough to know that I know that they know that. So I'm actually going to be limping with hands like jacks to intentionally snap them off when it happens. So that's the kind of leveling war that we're talking about here. But I think that principle would apply just as much on a final table as a bubble. Yeah, Kim?
I think the limping strategy is mostly employed when you're in the sort of 25 big blind defective stacks or so, and it's mainly applied from the button and the small blind, and occasionally the cutoff. So
yeah, and Kim,
not very much from early position.
And you're talking about like an actual balanced open limping range to get post flop with certain ranges, to play certain ranges against, like you're talking about like a big picture limping range, short stacked.
Yeah, more of like a linear range
Yeah.
for limping, so that if you're raised, you can easily call, especially when you have position as on the button.
Mm-hmm. And that, I think of that as like a strategy. That's like a big picture approach to playing a whole range of hands for a whole phase of the tournament. And then I think Ryan's thinking about like this particular spot where he like limps jacks in middle position or something as more like a tactic that he's going to employ in this particular hand. And I think I like this is a good example of how we should be thinking about strategy on how we build our general approach to poker, and then tactics that we're going to use from fight to fight, right? Like that's how, not to nerd myself out, but like that's how generals in the olden days, you talk about wars and battles are strategic, but what happens in the trenches is, tactics. Different parts of your mind are going to be occupied on different parts of these, and you just get to be thinking about them differently. Just like you say, Kim, no two spots are the same. So you wouldn't want to use the same tactic every time because you want to craft your best possible approach to this opponent. So the last thing that came up when I was watching the video, Ryan is so proficient with Poker Tracker. He talks a lot about ways to set up your reports and how to have your screen formatted to see things effectively and to be able to tell at a glance, different leaks or different frequencies and stats and things like that. I think that's really important. And I would just tell anyone who's here in the chat or anyone who is watching the video later, hand ranging is so important, and reviewing hand histories is really one of the best ways to put yourself in this position of having to examine spot after spot after spot. So I really can't stress enough how important hand history reviews are, whether you're doing them in a group or whether you're doing like with Ryan, whether you're coming to one of our Saturdays. I think the 2nd and 5th of every month, we do a hand history review or some other Poker Tracker review. Getting together with friends and just going hand by hand and sharing your thoughts with each other. That's how you're going to find different ways of thinking about the spots in these hands. And but it's also valuable just to do it on your own. And if anyone has Poker Tracker, go set the filters so that you're looking about a year ago or 6 months ago at a hand you don't remember, and pull up some of those hands, toggle off the feature that says display heroes hole cards, and then you'll review a hand in the Poker Tracker replayer where you don't actually know what your own hole cards are. And this is a really good opportunity for you to hand arrange yourself, because you know roughly what your own opening ranges are, you know roughly what your actions are going to be, but you won't remember exactly what hand you have in this spot. So just go pretend that it's a villain and just go street by street, action by action through the hand, assign yourself an opening range, and then assign yourself a reduce the combos as you go through the hand and see how you do. And I think knowing that you're doing it against your own range, that'll make it easier for you to kind of understand how to go through the steps. It'll be a little more positively reinforcing. And then when you start doing it to other opponents, the only thing you're really going to have to work on is assigning them an accurate range in the first place. And that just takes doing, thousands of times. But the more you do it, the better you get. The more you do it together, the more shortcuts we all learn from each other, the fewer of our own mistakes we have to learn from. I don't know about you guys. I'd much rather learn from all your mistakes than have to learn from my own mistakes, man. My own mistakes are costly and painful. So thanks for coming to our Saturday session of Learn Pro Poker video review. Eric, did you learn from anyone's mistakes today, or do you have some?
Hopefully.
Yeah,
I've been making a lot of mistakes lately, and hopefully I'm learning from them.
Well, that's what it takes, right? Well, everyone, if you have any questions, anyone can always email me, jim@rec.poker. Anyone who's interested can always premium membership at Rec Poker is only $15 a month, and if you use the code RecPoker at sign up, you get $10 off, and you have a chance to spend the best $5 in all of poker on 1 month of Rec Poker premium membership. So I hope you do. I hope you had fun today. I hope to see you in the home game soon, and otherwise just have a great weekend, everybody, and I'll see you soon. Thanks.
Thanks, Jim.
Guys.